Here is a question I want you to think about before we go any further, and drop your answer in the comments below. Do you think Trump extended the Iran deadline because he wanted to, or because he had no other choice? I'll give you my answer by the end of this video. But first, let me show you something almost nobody is talking about. On the morning of May 1st, 2025, something quietly extraordinary happened. Donald Trump, the man who built his entire political identity around the idea that America never flinches, never waits, never backs down, extended the deadline for Iran nuclear negotiations by 60 days. No fanfare, no press conference from the Rose Garden, just a statement from envoy Steve Witkoff, confirming that talks would continue and that military options were, for now, off the table. The headlines called it diplomacy. Some commentators called it patience. But here's what I think it actually was. It was the clearest signal yet that something inside this negotiation is not going according to plan, and that the pressure is not just on Iran, it is on Washington too. Let me explain why that matters. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this reach people who don't usually get this perspective from mainstream coverage. To understand what is actually happening here, you have to go back to the architecture of this negotiation, not the public version, but the structural reality underneath it. When Trump returned to office in January 2025, his Iran policy rested on three pillars. First, maximum economic pressure, the same framework he launched in his first term after tearing up the 2015 nuclear deal, officially known as the JCPOA. Second, the credible threat of military force, the idea that Iran would negotiate seriously only if it believed the cost of not negotiating was destruction. Third, a clear red line. Iran must not be allowed to cross the threshold into a functional nuclear weapons capability. On paper, this is a coherent strategy. Maximum pressure plus credible threat plus a clear goal. The problem is that each of those three pillars has developed serious structural cracks over the past several months, and the 60-day extension is not a sign that the strategy is working. It is a sign that the strategy has hit a wall, and the administration needs time to figure out what comes next. Iran's economy has been under American sanctions for decades. After Trump reimposed and then expanded maximum pressure sanctions following the 2018 withdrawal from the JCPOA, Iran's oil exports were cut significantly. The rial lost enormous value. Inflation hit ordinary Iranians hard, and the International Monetary Fund estimated Iran's economy contracted sharply in the years that followed. But here is what the pressure did not do. It did not stop Iran's nuclear program. In fact, the opposite happened. Under the 2015 deal, Iran had capped its uranium enrichment at 3.67%. After the deal collapsed, Iran began enriching to 60% purity, a level that has no civilian energy justification and sits uncomfortably close to the roughly 90% needed for weapons-grade material. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, confirmed this in multiple reports through 2023 and 2024. So the pressure paradox is this. The economic squeeze hurt Iran's population, but it accelerated Iran's nuclear program rather than stopping it. And by the time Trump came back for his second term, Iran had more nuclear leverage than it had in 2018, when the original deal was torn apart. That is not a starting position of strength for Washington. That is a starting position of a negotiator who has already spent the most important chips and is now sitting across from an opponent who has quietly upgraded its hand. What this suggests, and I want to be careful here to be clear, this is my analytical interpretation, is that the 60-day extension may reflect the recognition, at least somewhere inside the administration, that the maximum pressure model has reached its ceiling. You cannot squeeze harder than you already have if the other side has spent 7 years adapting to the squeeze. The second pillar, military credibility, is also more complicated than the public presentation suggests. Throughout early 2025, American officials, including Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, made statements indicating that military options remained actively on the table. Trump himself was characteristically direct, suggesting in multiple public comments that he would not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons, full stop. And the military assets to back that up are real. The United States has carrier strike groups in the region. It has long-range bombers capable of reaching Iranian targets. It has the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb, specifically designed to destroy hardened underground facilities like the ones Iran uses for uranium enrichment at Fordo. But here is the structural complication that rarely gets discussed in the mainstream coverage. Even the most optimistic American military planning assessments, and I want to be clear, these are assessments discussed publicly by defense analysts and in open congressional testimony, not classified materials, suggest that a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities would set back the program by somewhere between 1 and 3 years. not eliminate it, set it back. And that is before accounting for Iran's response, which the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has consistently promised would be significant and would extend beyond Iran's borders. The Strait of Hormuz alone tells you the stakes. Roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes through that waterway. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has noted it is the world's most important oil choke point. Any serious military conflict in the Persian Gulf puts that flow at risk in ways that would ripple through global oil markets immediately. So the credible military threat, which is supposed to make Iran negotiate, is credible only up to a point. Because the cost of exercising that threat is not just borne by Iran, it is borne by oil markets, by American allies in the Gulf, and ultimately by American consumers at the gas pump. And in my reading, that cost calculation is one of the quiet reasons the deadline got extended, rather than the military option getting activated. The third pillar, the clear red line on nuclear capability, is where things get philosophically interesting and strategically messy at the same time. The stated American position is that Iran cannot be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. That is bipartisan. That is consistent across administrations. But the question of exactly where the red line sits, enrichment level, stockpile size, weaponization capability, is where different parties within this negotiation have very different definitions. The Obama-era JCPOA set the line at enrichment capped at 3.67%, with significant monitoring and verification. The Trump administration's stated position going into 2025 talks has been reported by multiple outlets, including Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, as demanding a complete halt to enrichment, zero enrichment, full stop. Iran's position, stated publicly by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, is that enrichment on Iranian soil is a sovereign right and a non-negotiable red line of its own. Iran has said it is willing to discuss the level of enrichment, the size of its stockpile, the degree of monitoring, but eliminating enrichment entirely, that, Tehran says, is not on the table. This is not a small gap. This is a structural incompatibility between the two opening positions. And 60 additional days of negotiation does not automatically close a gap that fundamental. What it does is give both sides the political and diplomatic space to explore whether there is a formulation somewhere in the middle that each side can describe to its domestic audience as a win. That is how serious negotiations actually work, not through ultimatums that stick, but through the slow, grinding search for language that lets each party walk away claiming victory, while the underlying compromise is hidden in the details. The question, and this is the genuinely open question I think deserves serious attention, is whether any such formulation actually exists given the distance between the two starting positions, and whether 60 days is enough time to find it, assuming both sides are actually trying. That last assumption is not as safe as it sounds. And in the next part, I want to show you why the incentive structures on both sides of this negotiation are more complicated than they appear, and why some of the most important players in this story are not even sitting at the table. There is a concept in negotiation theory called the BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It simply means, what do you do if the talks fail? And the reason it matters is that the side with the stronger BATNA almost always has more leverage at the table. So let's look at both sides honestly. If these talks fail, Iran's BATNA is painful but survivable. Iran has been living under sanctions since 1979. Its economy has adapted, not thrived, but adapted. It has built domestic supply chains, found alternative trading partners, and developed what economists call a sanctions-resistant economic structure. Iran's trade with China alone has grown substantially in recent years. According to data cited by the Atlantic Council, Iran-China bilateral trade reached roughly $15 billion in 2023 and has continued expanding under long-term energy agreements that Washington's sanctions have struggled to fully interrupt. If talks fail, Iran enriches further. It moves closer to a nuclear threshold. It gains more leverage for the next round of negotiations, whenever those happen, under whatever administration comes next. That is a bad outcome, but it is a survivable one for Tehran. Now look at Washington's BATNA. If talks fail, the administration faces a choice between two options that both carry enormous costs. Option 1, walk away and accept a nuclear threshold Iran, which means admitting that maximum pressure did not work and that the red line was not enforced. That is a massive political and strategic defeat. Option 2, military action, which, as I laid out in the first part of this story, carries the risk of a regional escalation, an oil price shock, and a program that gets set back but not eliminated, meaning the problem returns in a few years under worse conditions. Neither of those is a strong BATNA. And that asymmetry, Iran's painful but survivable alternative versus Washington's costly either-way alternative, is one of the structural reasons the deadline got extended rather than the ultimatum enforced. In my view, this is the single most underreported dynamic in the entire Iran negotiation story. The administration is not negotiating from a position of pure strength. It is negotiating from a position where the cost of failure falls disproportionately on the side issuing the ultimatums. Now let me bring in the players who are not at the table, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Saudi Arabia has a direct and immediate stake in how this ends. The kingdom processes and exports oil that transits through or near the Persian Gulf. Any military conflict that disrupts Gulf shipping hits Saudi Aramco's revenues almost instantly. The Saudis have been engaged in their own quiet diplomacy with Iran, a process brokered by China that produced a landmark agreement in 2023, restoring diplomatic relations between Riyadh and Tehran after years of hostility. That agreement is fragile. It has not resolved deep tensions, but it exists, and it represents something important, a regional architecture that was built without Washington at the center. The Gulf states, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, are in a similarly complicated position. They host American military bases. They rely on the US security umbrella. But they also trade with Iran, sometimes indirectly, and they have their own economic interests in regional stability that do not always align perfectly with Washington's maximum pressure framework. Qatar, for example, has maintained working relationships with Tehran, partly because the two countries share the world's largest natural gas field, the North Dome on the Qatari side, South Pars on the Iranian side. Geopolitics does not erase geography. Then there is Israel. And here I want to be precise because this part of the story is often reported in ways that generate more heat than light. Israel's stated position has been consistent. Iran must not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. Israeli officials across the political spectrum, from the current government under Prime Minister Netanyahu to opposition figures, hold this as a fundamental security interest. That position is understandable given Israel's strategic situation and the explicit hostility Iran's government has expressed toward it. But the question of what Israel prefers in terms of a negotiated outcome versus a military outcome is more nuanced than the headlines suggest. Some Israeli security analysts, including former Mossad officials who have spoken on the record in Israeli media, have argued that a credible deal that verifiably limits Iran's program would serve Israeli security better than a military strike that sets the program back temporarily and potentially accelerates it afterward in a more determined and less transparent form. Others in the Israeli security establishment take the opposite view, that only the elimination of enrichment capability provides genuine security, and that any deal that leaves enrichment infrastructure in place is a deal that buys time rather than solves the problem. This internal Israeli debate matters for the American negotiation, because the United States and Israel are in close consultation throughout this process. And if there is disagreement within Israel's own security establishment about what outcome to push for, that disagreement flows into the American deliberations as well, making an already complicated negotiation even harder to bring to a clean conclusion. What this picture tells me is that the 60-day extension is not just a pause in the American-Iranian negotiation. It is a pause in a much larger system of overlapping interests. Saudi stability, Gulf economic security, Israeli threat perception, Chinese energy supply, global oil market equilibrium, and every one of those interests pulls in a slightly different direction. The administration is not just negotiating with Iran. It is managing a coalition of regional actors who each have their own definition of an acceptable outcome. And 60 days is a very short window to reconcile all of those definitions into a single agreement. Here is what I find most telling about the extension itself. The administration did not announce it as a concession. It announced it as a sign of progress. Specifically, Steve Witkoff described the talks as moving in a positive direction and said both sides had shown a willingness to engage seriously. That framing is deliberate, because in a negotiation this visible, the narrative around the process is almost as important as the process itself. If you announce an extension by saying, "We need more time because we haven't solved the hard problems yet," you signal weakness. You give the other side leverage. You tell your domestic audience that the strategy isn't working. But if you announce an extension by saying things are moving in a positive direction and we are making progress, you maintain the appearance of control. You give yourself political cover, and you buy time without publicly admitting that you needed it. Whether that framing reflects the actual state of the talks or is largely a political construction, that is the question I genuinely cannot answer from public information. And I think anyone who tells you they can answer it with certainty is probably overstating what they actually know. What I can say is this. The gap between the two sides' stated positions going into the extension was wide enough that 60 days of good faith negotiation would need to produce something genuinely creative, a formulation on enrichment, verification, and sanctions relief that neither side has publicly articulated yet, to result in a deal both governments can defend at home. And in the next part, I want to show you what that deal might actually look like if it happens, and what the global economic consequences look like if it doesn't. because those two scenarios produce very different worlds, and the distance between them is larger than most people realize. Let me paint two pictures for you, not predictions, scenarios. Two structurally different outcomes that flow logically from where this negotiation currently sits. And I want you to think about which one the global economy is currently pricing in, because I think the answer is more interesting than most financial commentary is letting on. Scenario 1. A deal gets done. Not a perfect deal. Not a comprehensive agreement that resolves every point of tension between Washington and Tehran, but a functional framework, what diplomats sometimes call a less-for-less arrangement, where Iran agrees to cap enrichment at a verifiable level, probably somewhere between the 3.67% of the original JCPOA and the 20% threshold that historically triggers serious alarm, accepts enhanced IAEA monitoring, and agrees to reduce its enriched uranium stockpile. In exchange, the United States provides meaningful sanctions relief, not full normalization, but enough to allow Iran to increase oil exports and access frozen assets. What does that do to the world? Iranian oil comes back to the market in meaningful volumes. Iran was producing roughly 3.8 million barrels per day before the original JCPOA sanctions were imposed. Under maximum pressure, that dropped significantly. A sanctions relief deal would not instantly restore full production. Infrastructure degrades, investment takes time. But even a partial restoration of 500,000 to 1 million additional barrels per day would have a measurable impact on global oil supply. The Energy Information Administration has modeled scenarios in which additional Persian Gulf supply pushes Brent crude prices meaningfully lower. Lower oil prices flow through to lower gasoline prices for American consumers. They reduce inflationary pressure on transport and manufacturing, and they reduce revenue for every oil exporting nation that has been benefiting from elevated prices, including Russia, whose federal budget has become heavily dependent on oil and gas revenues to fund its ongoing military operations in Ukraine. That last point is not a side note. It is one of the structural reasons some analysts argue a deal with Iran actually serves broader American strategic interests beyond the nuclear question alone. If Iranian oil re-enters the market and pushes prices down, it tightens the fiscal pressure on Moscow at a moment when that pressure matters enormously. This is the kind of multi-board strategic thinking that rarely makes it into a single news headline, but shapes how serious policymakers actually think about these decisions. A deal also changes the regional dynamic in ways that are harder to quantify, but no less real. Iran, with sanctions relief, has more to lose from future conflict. A country that has just had its economy partially opened has stronger incentives to protect that opening than a country that has been living in an economic siege and has nothing left to lose from escalation. That is not a guarantee of Iranian moderation. Iran's regional behavior, its support for proxy groups across the Middle East, would not automatically change because of a nuclear deal. The 2015 JCPOA demonstrated that clearly, but economic state creates a different calculus. It does not eliminate risk. It changes the cost-benefit structure. Now, scenario 2, the talks collapse. This is where I want to be particularly careful to stick to structural analysis rather than alarmism, because the consequences here are serious without needing any exaggeration. If the 60-day extension produces no agreement, if the gap on enrichment proves unbridgeable, or if domestic political pressures on either side make a compromise impossible to sell, then the administration faces the choice I described earlier: walk away or act militarily. Walking away means accepting a nuclear threshold Iran, a country that has all the components of a nuclear weapon and could assemble one in a matter of weeks, according to some assessments by non-proliferation experts. The administration has said publicly it will not accept this outcome. So in theory, walking away is not an option, which means the alternative becomes military action. And military action against Iran's nuclear facilities, even a targeted limited strike, carries consequences that extend well beyond the strike itself. Iran has stated repeatedly and consistently that any military attack on its territory would result in the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Whether Iran could sustain that closure is debatable. The U.S. Navy has enormous capability in the region, but even a temporary disruption, even a period of weeks where tanker traffic through the strait becomes uncertain or dangerous, would send oil prices sharply higher. Goldman Sachs and other major financial institutions have published analyses suggesting that a serious Hormuz disruption scenario could push Brent crude above $150 per barrel. At that price, the impact on the American economy, already navigating elevated interest rates and consumer price pressures, would be severe and immediate. And there is a longer-term consequence that I think deserves more attention than it typically gets. A military strike that fails to eliminate Iran's nuclear program, which is the likely outcome given the program's dispersal across multiple hardened underground sites, removes the diplomatic path for years. You cannot bomb a country and then immediately ask it to come back to the negotiating table. The domestic political situation in Tehran after any military strike would make any Iranian government that agreed to negotiate look like it was surrendering to aggression. That is not a path any Iranian leadership could survive politically. So a failed military option does not solve the nuclear problem. It accelerates it, removes the diplomatic track, and adds a regional conflict on top of all the existing pressures. That is the structural logic that I believe is sitting quietly underneath the decision to extend the deadline. Not weakness in the conventional sense, but a clear-eyed recognition that the costs of the alternative are higher than the cost of 60 more days of uncertainty. Now, here is where the global economic picture becomes genuinely fascinating, and where I think most of the mainstream financial coverage is missing something important. Oil markets are currently pricing in a higher probability of a deal than the political news coverage would suggest. Brent crude has remained in a range that reflects some expectation of Iranian supply returning, not a certainty, but a meaningful probability. If you look at options markets for oil, the instruments traders use to hedge against price spikes, the premium for upside protection has risen, but has not spiked to levels that would suggest markets believe a military conflict is imminent. What this tells me, and again, this is my interpretation, not financial advice, is that professional energy traders who have real money on the line and access to serious analytical resources are reading this extension as more likely to produce a deal than to collapse into conflict. Markets are not always right, but when professional traders with genuine skin in the game are pricing something differently than the political headlines suggest, it is worth paying attention to the gap between those two pictures. The 60-day clock is now running, and what happens inside that window, not just in the negotiating rooms in Oman, where the indirect talks have reportedly been taking place, but in the domestic political environments in both Washington and Tehran, will determine which of these two very different worlds we actually end up in. In the final part, I want to pull back and look at the biggest picture of all, what this moment tells us about the way American power actually operates in the world right now. Because I think the Iran negotiation is not just about Iran. It is a case study in the limits and possibilities of American strategic leverage in a world that has quietly become more multipolar than Washington's public posture usually acknowledges. There is a pattern that runs through every major American foreign policy challenge of the last 20 years. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, North Korea, and now Iran. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The pattern is this. America enters each situation with overwhelming military and economic advantages. It applies those advantages, and then it discovers that military and economic power can destroy things, can sanction things, can threaten things, but it cannot by itself produce the specific political outcome it was trying to achieve. The gap between what American power can do and what American strategy needs it to do is where these situations tend to get complicated. Iran is the clearest current example of this pattern. The United States has the most powerful military in the history of the world. It has a dollar-based financial system that still forms the backbone of global trade. It has the ability to impose sanctions that genuinely hurt any country's economy. And it has been applying all of those tools against Iran for going on 5 decades, and Iran still has not produced the political transformation those tools were designed to achieve. That is not an argument that America is weak. It is an argument that the tools and the goal have been mismatched for a very long time. And the 60-day extension, in my reading, is a quiet acknowledgement of that mismatch, an implicit recognition that pressure alone is not going to get you to a signed agreement. At some point, you have to negotiate. And negotiating means accepting that the other side has interests too, interests that are not going to disappear because you applied enough economic pain. Now, let me tell you what I think is the genuinely underappreciated dimension of this moment. The world that this Iran negotiation is happening in is structurally different from the world in which the original JCPOA was negotiated in 2015. In 2015, China was a rising power, but still largely operating within American-dominated international frameworks. Russia was a problematic partner, but not an open adversary. The dollar's dominance of global energy markets was unchallenged, and the idea that major oil-producing nations might start settling energy trades in non-dollar currencies was considered fringe speculation. 10 years later, none of those things are as true as they were. China has become Iran's largest trading partner. Chinese state companies have continued investing in Iranian energy infrastructure despite American sanctions, accepting the risk of secondary sanctions in exchange for access to discounted Iranian oil. Russia and Iran have deepened their economic and military relationship in ways that would have seemed unlikely a decade ago. And the broader movement away from dollar-denominated energy trade, what financial analysts have started calling de-dollarization, while still early and incomplete, is further along than it was in 2015. What this means for the Iran negotiation is important. In 2015, the international coalition behind the sanctions included Europe, Russia, and China. All of them signed the JCPOA. That coalition gave the sanctions real teeth because Iran had nowhere to turn. In 2025, that coalition does not exist. Europe is nominally aligned with American policy, but has been deeply reluctant to reimpose sanctions after the American withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 that the Europeans explicitly opposed. Russia has no interest in helping Washington pressure Iran, and China has demonstrated repeatedly that it will continue doing business with Tehran, regardless of what Washington prefers. So the maximum pressure strategy is operating in a world where maximum pressure has fewer enforcers and more workarounds than it did the last time it was tried. The pressure is real, but its ceiling is lower. And the 60-day extension reflects, at least in part, the practical reality of trying to apply a 2018 strategy to a 2025 geopolitical landscape. Here's what I think the next 60 days will actually tell us. Not about Iran specifically, but about something larger. If a deal gets done, even an imperfect one, it will demonstrate that American diplomacy can still produce agreements in a more multipolar world. It will show that the combination of pressure and engagement can reach outcomes that pressure alone cannot. And it will give the administration a genuine achievement on one of the most complex foreign policy files in the world. If the talks collapse and military action follows, the consequences I described in the previous part unfold. But beyond the immediate economic and regional consequences, there is a longer-term strategic question that I think is the most important one of all. If the United States strikes Iran, fails to eliminate its nuclear program, triggers a regional escalation, and ends up with oil above $150, who benefits from that outcome? Not American consumers, not European allies, not the Gulf states that depend on regional stability. The countries that benefit from high oil prices, from Western strategic overextension, and from American attention being absorbed in a new military commitment in the Middle East, those countries are not hard to identify, and none of them are American allies. That is the systemic risk that I think deserves far more serious public discussion than it is currently getting. Every major strategic decision creates second and third order effects, things that happen not because anyone planned them, but because systems respond to disruptions in ways that serve whoever is positioned to benefit from the chaos. The 60-day extension does not resolve that risk, but it delays it. And in geopolitics, sometimes delay is the most valuable thing you can buy, because it creates space for something unexpected to happen. A domestic political shift in Tehran, a change in the negotiating team's composition, a back-channel agreement that produces public progress without anyone having to publicly concede anything. History is full of negotiations that looked impossible right up until the moment they produced a deal. And history is equally full of confrontations that looked manageable right up until the moment they spiraled. The honest answer, the one I think genuine analysis requires, is that we do not know yet which of those histories this 60-day window is writing. What we do know is that the decision to extend rather than escalate was not made in a vacuum. It was made by people who could see both paths and chose, for now, to keep the diplomatic one open. Whether that choice reflects wisdom, necessity, or simply the recognition that the alternative was worse, maybe it is all three at once, because in the real world, those things are rarely separate. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments because I read them and they shape future stories on this channel. Do you think a deal between the United States and Iran is actually possible before this deadline expires? And if it happens, do you think it holds? Drop your answer below. And if you found this analysis useful, if it gave you a frame for understanding this story that you did not have before, share it with one person who you think would find it genuinely interesting. That is how independent analysis like this reaches people who are looking for something more than headlines. I will be watching this story closely, and when the next significant development breaks, whether that is progress, collapse, or something nobody saw coming, we will be back here to break it down together.